just simply being infected with HIV is not going to do it. You need certain cofactors.
Cofactors are not necessary?
Dr. Fauci will say HIV causes AIDS without the need for anything else. That's kind of ridiculous.
The data that indicate that any different type of infection like mycoplasma or something like that is a necessary cofactor, I believe those theories have been debunked.
What the fuck does he mean? Sorry. What's it in? Sorry, what does he mean that there are no cofactors? Where's he coming from? There's cofactors for everything.
And I understand there are a lot of people, if you ask them about HIV causing AIDS as being a fact, they'll say, of course, it's indisputable. And the very fact that they will say it's indisputable might lead you to question their ability to understand scientific method. People that think any scientific fact is indisputable don't understand about scientific fact.
It has become a very emotional kind of thing because people actually, they get personally committed to what really is a body of evidence that can be analyzed, you know, by lots of people. And at this point, there's so much of it out there, nobody can really analyze it, all of it. But nobody can write a review of it that says HIV causes AIDS because of this. You know, if a postdoc were to write a review of the literature that showed without much doubt that HIV was the cause of AIDS, that guy would be famous. Now, there's 100,000 guys out there who've had the opportunity. 10 years has passed. We've been waiting for this star postdoctoral fellow to distinguish himself forever and get a lifelong grant from Tony Fauci, but he hasn't shown up. No one has bothered to write a definitive review. Any journal would take it. That right there proves that HIV does not cause AIDS.
Let's talk for a moment about testing. What are your thoughts on someone going out and getting a quote-unquote AIDS test?
Really, when we say it's an AIDS test, that's a misnomer. It's not a test for AIDS at all. And surprisingly, something that it took me a long time to figure out, it's not even a test for HIV. The test is for antibodies that are supposed to be antibodies to HIV, but they're not. It's a test for non-specific antibodies that may or may not have anything to do with HIV.
A very heavily referenced review article on the validity of the HIV tests had more or less concluded that they had never been validated. At the time, I didn't quite realize that one of the implications in this article was that HIV itself had never properly been isolated. It was so difficult to isolate and obtain that was the reason why the HIV tests had never been validated, because to validate a diagnostic test according to the classical decent standards, you need to show that patients who test positive with your antibody kit have got the virus in them, and patients who don't test positive are free of the virus. Broadly, that would be how you would establish its validity. And that had never been done, because you can't find this virus in AIDS patients or in HIV-positive patients.
HIV, first of all, nobody's ever found it in a human being. Think of it. The so-called HIV tests do not detect HIV in a person. They detect your antibodies that react to some proteins that are produced at Abbott Laboratory. They do not find HIV in the person. They find a person's functioning immune system that could react against HIV if it were there.
Millions of people take tests that are referred to as HIV tests. However, the idea that there is a laboratory test that can determine whether or not a person is infected with the virus is simply an illusion. The FDA has never approved a test kit that claims to be used for the purpose of diagnosing HIV infection.
The ultimate test that the establishment offers is what's called a co-culture technique, where you take a sample of the individual's blood cells, white blood cells. You cannot find HIV now in this sample. All you have are these blood cells. But then you culture these cells with some special cells that Robert Gallo generated some years ago. You have to throw in some powerful chemicals, phytohemagglutinin or IL-2, for example, to force these cells to do anything. The idea is to wake up the patient cells to start producing RNA, and then this RNA will be coated in a protein, and possibly then there will be viral particles produced in the medium. These viral particles now will go infect the other cells that you added, and then you will amplify by a period of time, the replication of these viral particles in the laboratory, what we call in vitro. Now, these particles did not exist in the patient, in the human being, the person that you got the sample from. You created them in the laboratory. And by creating these virus particles in the laboratory, people say they have isolated HIV from a human being. They have not done any such thing.
Nobody was looking at the blood of an AIDS patient and finding it crawling with some new organism and said, hey, this is this virus that we call HIV now.
Is there a test that can definitively tell you if you're infected with virus?
With the virus, sure.
And what is that test?
Well, the test is to do the ELISA test, which really demonstrates, and in essence it's a surrogate also because it represents antibody production to the virus. But they have demonstrated the virus. They've had crystalline models of the virus. HIV exists.
I don't recommend people ever getting tested. The reason is I don't know what the tests mean, and I think no one else knows what the tests mean. I've never seen any evidence that what these tests purport to show, they're actually showing, namely the presence of a virus, the presence of an exogenous virus. I really would like to see the electron microscopic data of this, and apparently there is none. There is none where you've done a rigorous isolation protocol.
The test is for antibodies that are supposed to be antibodies to HIV, but they're not. It's a test for non-specific antibodies that may or may not have anything to do with HIV. So it's not at all like we're being told, and it's really, when you think about it, if you're told that testing is responsible, it's a pretty irresponsible test to be taking.
In the gay community, everybody tests all the time. Everybody around me was taking HIV tests. It's the responsible thing to do. It's sort of a gay rite of passage to regularly get tested. You know, and consequently many people around me tested positive.
In essence, AIDS is advanced HIV infection as opposed to early HIV infection. AIDS is when you're ill, and HIV infection without AIDS is when you're heading towards being ill but you're not ill.
I always assumed that if you had AIDS, as opposed to being just HIV positive, that you were very sick, that you had pneumonia or KS or chronic diarrhea or something. That changed for me when I myself was diagnosed with AIDS. And I was diagnosed not because of an illness, not because I was sick or that my immune system didn't seem to be working, but because my CD4 count had dropped below 200, which according to the CDC definition is what defines AIDS, an HIV positive test and a CD4 count of less than 200.
In 1993 in this country we adopted a definition that caused the number of AIDS cases to double overnight, and part of that reason was for the first time we began counting people as AIDS victims who were not ill and who did not have any symptoms. They had a low T-cell count. And that's only one low T-cell count, and T-cells are something that can fluctuate 100% in a given day. So based on a low T-cell count, that year the number of AIDS cases doubled overnight, and with that definition there have been 182,000 Americans who are not ill diagnosed with AIDS who would not have AIDS if they moved to Canada, because in Canada they don't recognize that T-cell definition as a criteria for having an AIDS diagnosis.
Most people consider it blasphemous when you point out that AIDS is not a disease, it's a syndrome, it's a collection of diseases. And those diseases get called AIDS if they occur in a patient that the doctor somehow concludes is HIV positive.
All of the diseases in the category called AIDS occur to people who are HIV negative. None of them are exclusive to people who test HIV positive, and all of them have causes and treatments that are known, well known, that are completely unrelated to HIV. So any of these diseases, when they happen to somebody who tests HIV negative, are called by their old name, but when they occur in someone who tests HIV positive, then they're called AIDS.
All kinds of diseases started coming into the AIDS family faster than anyone should have been comfortable with, really. To go from 2 or 3 to go to 30 in a few years was like somebody should have said, hey, there's something wrong here, and it's got to be financial. Things don't happen that fast in science. You don't suddenly notice that one new organism is causing every problem. I mean, it was a bizarre thing that happened. It really was. It didn't really have any precedence in terms of medicine before that, unless perhaps you could think of the possession by the devil stuff, right? You see, once you're possessed by the devil, anything that happens to you or anything you do is got to do with that, right? So it makes it easier for you to get tuberculosis, and it makes it easier for you to get uterine cancer. It makes it easier for you to get Candida albicans. And so all those things can now be called AIDS. Now, why would anybody do that? And why would any reasonable doctor start lumping together various symptoms into one pile and think all this is caused by HIV?
We have a test, but it's not a test for AIDS, and it's called an HIV test, but it's not a test for HIV, and we have a series of problems that we are calling AIDS, but that doesn't elevate AIDS into a disease. I don't know if you read magazines lately, there's a lot of ads for pharmaceutical drugs lately. These pharmaceutical companies are marketing more and more direct to consumers and encouraging you to ask your doctor for the remedy of the day. And I noticed that there's a lot of these syndromes popping up, like a social anxiety disorder or SAD. I mean, you can make a syndrome out of anything you want, basically, and then find medicines to sell to make people better from it. And AIDS is not that, ludicrously simple, but it is, in a sense, just as constructed. It's a construct. It's a category of other problems, some of which were occurring in greater numbers in a very small subset of people here in the U.S. and other parts of the world, that became, due to the social political climate with regard to sex, death, homosexuality, and drug use, it became elevated into this medical phenomenon that has become untouchable and sacred almost.
There's the saying that if you knew how what sausages are made of, most people would hesitate to sort of eat them because they wouldn't like what's in it. And if you knew how HIV/AIDS numbers are cooked or made up, you would use them with extreme caution.
In late December of 2007, I read about new legislation passed in New Jersey calling for the mandatory testing of pregnant women or newborn infants should the mother's status be unknown.
HIV mandatory testing, to me, is a no-brainer.
I'm very much opposed to the concept of mandatory testing of any population because the tests are scientifically shown to be unreliable and inaccurate.
You have no reason to fear this bill. And my hope is that eventually this will become a federal law so that every woman in this country could be tested.
But HIV testing isn't an absolutely precise science.
When I confronted my doctor about that, she said, we're way past Western blot now. We have the viral load test. That when you get the package insert for the viral load test, it says,
if you test positive, you are considered confirmed infected with HIV. But at the bottom of the page, In fine print, it states a person should have additional testing.
It does not allow you to tell a single person on this planet that they are HIV positive. And it's a scandal that this test continues to be used.
So again, I'm asking, where's the test? Where's the test that can confirm a diagnosis of HIV infection? And I can't find one.
In light of all this scientific uncertainty, I asked Dr. Fauci for evidence linking HIV to immune deficiency disease.
When you put the combined findings of the initial characterization as a distinct retrovirus isolated by Montagnier and his group, together with Gallo linking the virus to being the cause of AIDS, and they put those things together, and that's how we have a confirmation of the causative agent of AIDS, namely HIV.
Still unclear about the evidence for HIV's existence, I decided the best way to verify it would be to actually see it. I asked Dr. Hans Gelderblum, a world-renowned electron microscopist, if he thought there was any reason to question Dr. Montagnier's published images.
I've seen these publications, stamp-sized images. It's a nuisance. It's a nuisance. You do not really see much.
When we saw that photo, we said, suggestive, but not convincing.
Dr. Gallo, 1 year later, published photographs he claimed to be of HIV. Were his any better?
These pictures were not so impressive. They were not much better than Montagnier's images.
It's one thing to look like, and another thing is to be a virus.
In 2002, I stumbled across an article by Valander Turner and Andrew McIntyre of the Perth Group in Australia, and it questioned whether there's ever even been found a virus. I became consumed with researching this. I could read from morning till night every day, and every link to another link, and I would email to these people and say, where's the test? I want to know. Am I dying? Am I contagious? And they weren't even very kind. They were just like, read our articles again. How many times do we have to tell you?
So where does all this lead? Well, to recap, what we've seen is that back in the 80s and 90s and even through to the present day, this idea of testing people for AIDS was a fraud. What it really was an HIV test, and that turned out to be a fraud too, because you really can't test reliably for HIV. So what does that mean? Does that matter? Does that affect anybody? Well, it sure does. Millions of people were given positive HIV tests and were told that they were going to die from AIDS. And then they were terrorized into taking first AZT, which is a very toxic drug. It is a mutagen, it is a carcinogen, it kills cells, and it killed a lot of people. And then Fauci and friends got more sophisticated, and they lowered the AZT dose, and they mixed it with a whole bunch of other toxic drugs, and they called it a cocktail. And then they went out and decided, hey, we're going to test the world. We're going to test pregnant women to make sure they're not carrying the virus. Not that they were sick, not that they had any symptoms, but they wanted to see, are they carrying the virus? And they did the same thing in Africa. And then after they increased the number of diseases from 2 to nearly 30 that could be classified as AIDS, and after they started a global testing program of, quote, vulnerable populations, which just coincidentally happened to be people not in a position to defend themselves easily, they started to find AIDS everywhere. Including in Africa, but including in the United States. And wouldn't you know, one of the communities they found a lot of AIDS was the African American community. And they tested a lot of women, and they found a lot of HIV positive women. And they decided, well, let's go forward and see what Dr. Fauci decided to do.
We're at NIH today to talk to Dr. Tony Fauci about the Mississippi baby. Doctor, can you tell us about the announcement that was made this week?
Well, the Mississippi baby, as many people know now because it got considerable publicity, was a child that was born of a mother who was HIV infected, but who unfortunately had no prenatal care and was not receiving antiretroviral drugs.
Did you get that? This is a woman who had a positive HIV test, which he calls HIV infected. Okay? Not the same thing, not accurate, not scientifically sound, as we've seen before. But he makes that leap. And then he says, unfortunately, the mother was not getting drugs. So in Tony Fauci's world, if you are a poor African American woman or a poor African woman and you come up positive on one of these unreliable tests, in his world, the best thing that could possibly happen to you is that you would be given a lot of carcinogenic and mutagenic drugs to, quote, control the virus.
A mother who was HIV infected, but who unfortunately had no prenatal care and was not receiving antiretroviral drugs. And at the time of birth, within the first 30 hours of birth, the baby was put on a therapeutic dose regimen of antiretroviral drugs, as opposed to waiting to see if the baby was infected and only giving him a prophylactic or a prevention dose.
So if you heard what Tony Fauci said there, the mother was positive on an HIV test, no indication of whether she was sick, no indication of whether she had any symptoms, and they called her HIV infected, and they went ahead and gave this newborn baby antiviral drugs at birth, based just on that, and nothing else. They didn't even bother to test the infant with one of the bogus HIV tests to see if the baby was positive or not. Just gave the baby drugs, powerful carcinogenic, mutagenic drugs.
As it turned out, the aggressive approach towards the baby was the right choice because the baby turned out to be infected. The baby was treated with combination antiretroviral drugs for 18 months and then was unfortunately lost to follow-up. And over that period of time, the baby was not receiving any antiretroviral drugs. And when the baby returned to clinic, which was 5 months later, the physicians examined the baby and found to their surprise that there was no detectable virus at all.
You know, speechless, right? Without, you know, based on a unreliable test, based on no symptoms, based on nothing, and then not even testing the infant, they decided to put the infant on antiviral drugs. And they considered that a good thing to do. And then, luckily, temporarily at least, the child escaped the clutches of these maniacs for a period of several months. And when they retested the infant had no HIV in that particular test. And we already know how unreliable and nonsensical all those tests are. And Fauci expresses surprise. Now, there's a lot of twists and turns in this case, and it just goes on and on and on. And Fauci keeps twisting it and twisting it and twisting it until he proves what he wants to prove, which is it's a good idea to do these kinds of things. It's a good idea to use an unreliable test on pregnant women, and if they come up with a positive reading, to put them on antivirals. And then when their infants are born, no need to test them, and you don't even need to have a pretense of testing them, just put them on antivirals too. So this is what's going on in the United States right now. This is what's going on in Africa. Millions of people, if their numbers are correct, I mean, they may be taking a lot of the money and just stealing it. We don't know what these people are doing, but we do know that a definite number of actual real people are being subjected to this horror. All right? And why does this matter? Well, there's a deadly virus floating around, and clearly Tony Fauci is in charge of how the media is going to talk about it, and we're being told we all need to be tested for it. We're not told whether these tests are reliable or unreliable or not. It is strange that there's multiple different kinds of tests. If there's a test that works, why aren't we using the one that works? Well, this could be the HIV test all over again. But here's the consequences for you. If you don't have the antibodies, they're going to suggest to you that you need the newly minted COVID-19 vaccination. And it may be a little bit more than a suggestion. It may be mandatory. Or if you decline to get it, you may find yourself facing some significant restrictions. Like maybe you won't be able to get on an airplane. Maybe you won't be able to leave and or return to the country. It may seem extreme, Well, here's Bill Gates, Tony Fauci's best buddy, telling you how he'd like it to be.
Trade-off, you just mentioned, obviously, the economic pain. What do you think the right balance is between the trade-off of protecting people's lives and the economic hit? I mean, do you see a situation where the global economy could be virtually at a standstill for a year or even more?
Well, it won't go to zero, but it will shrink. Global GDP is going to take, probably the biggest hit ever. Maybe the Depression was worse, or 1873, I don't know. But in my lifetime, this will be the greatest economic hit. But you don't have a choice. People act like you have a choice. People don't feel like going to the stadium when they might get infected. It's not the government who's saying, okay, just ignore this disease. And, people are deeply affected by seeing these deaths, by knowing they could be part of the transmission chain, and old people, their parents, their grandparents could be affected by this, and so you don't get to say ignore what's going on here. There will be the ability, particularly in rich countries, to open up if things are done well over the next few months, but for the world at large, normalcy only returns when we've largely vaccinated the entire global population. And so, although there's a lot of work on testing, a lot of work on drugs that we're involved with, trying to achieve that ambitious goal, which has never been done for the vaccine, that rises to the top of the list.
Eventually, what we'll have to have is certificates of who's a recovered person, who's a vaccinated person, because you don't want people moving around the world where you'll have some countries that won't have it under control. Sadly, you don't want to completely block off the ability for those, people to go there and come back and move around. So eventually there will be sort of this digital immunity proof that will help facilitate the global reopening up.
AIDS is a chronic, long-term breakdown of the immune system that can be caused by multiple factors, generally more than one of them operating within any particular person with AIDS, or with what has been described as AIDS. And at the top of that in the West would be recreational drug use, also pharmaceutical drug use, repeated infections, including infections with diseases that are genuinely sexually transmitted, repeated antibiotic treatments for these, a lifestyle that involves a lot of partying, lack of nutrition, and in the less developed world, AIDS is primarily a disease of malnutrition, starvation, and the endemic infections that have been part of those environments for years.
Looking back, over 25 years, I think I'm probably the longest running AIDS dissident. I began in earnest, well, actually in about 1981, but, in earnest in 1983. And my first major AIDS article was in 1985. So I was, 2 years ahead of Duisberg. In the early days, the very early AIDS cases were really quite sick. And there were very good reasons why they were sick, mostly drugs, but not entirely. Some, had been born sick. But then at a certain point, when that sort of AIDS had virtually ceased to exist, there became a new type of AIDS. So they expanded the definition, and also they began giving the anti-HIV drugs to people who were, in fact, not even sick, but merely positive on the HIV tests. And in that case, of course, when they finally became sick enough from the AIDS drugs, then they were called AIDS patients. I would simply have to say that my main concern is the gay men who have been murdered. I don't think murder is too strong a word to use when you have a drug like ACT and all of the nucleoside analogs that followed, more or less on its coattail. approved on the basis of fraudulent research, and where, as you know, Joseph Sonneman said, AZT is incompatible with life. Well, if it's incompatible with life, it's a poison, and if it's a poison that kills people, in contexts like that, it's murder.
What do you know, John? What would you guess for the number of people who were really sickened and killed, who had no presenting illnesses, just a positive test for the proteins, for the antibodies that were supposed to be specific to HIV? How many people were we killing with this drug?
Well, here one has to guess. I mean, I followed the CDC's statistics very well year by year, but then they stopped reporting certain things. But I have a pretty good estimate that 1/3 gay men were killed by AZT poisoning. And I have a table I created, it's on my website somewhere.
Wow.
I would say, I don't even know now. They stopped reporting AIDS deaths by year, which made it impossible to track certain things.
Yeah, I noticed that also, that the statistics, especially around 1997, was a big year where the next year, all of a sudden, they'd removed all the good stuff out of the reports. All that really they concentrate now on is how many cases there are in each city, in each state, which I guess is purely for funding purposes.
Well, I think it's deliberate. I don't think they want tracking to be done on their statistics.
But if you take a look at their own statistics, though, you take a look at those 1983, 84, 85, 86, 87, really, we're talking a relative handful in a country of then 250 million, 260, 270 million people, maybe 5,000, 10,000 people. It really wasn't until the late 80s when AZT came along that we really saw, even by their own figures, the number of deaths attributed to AIDS going up. That was at the point that this chemotherapy for life, this harsh drug, AZT, was being introduced.
The epidemic went from a few gay men to now, today, 78 million people having been infected, 39 million deaths, 35 million people living with HIV, and the epidemic still rages with over 2 million new infections each year. So this is a list of the drugs that have been developed for HIV, and it's extraordinary that I went from 1981 through the middle of the 1990s taking care of people without adequate therapy. And then as the years went by, from 1987 through the mid-90s, we developed these 30 drugs, and this I consider one of the most important transformative discoveries in biological sciences.